This is Public Policy, and I'm your professor, Dr. Patrick Stewart. The purpose of this class is to consider policy typologies. Generally speaking, typologies are highly important for understanding the world. How you cut the world influences your interactions with it, and this has, as a result, been an important part of any scientific endeavor. The challenges is that some typologies are so broad they miss important information. Some are so narrow they overwhelm. Policy typologies have this problem with the question of what types of typologies should there be. But this is compounded by the nature of highly complex human behavior. Initial attempts to develop typologies weren't as successful because they were narrow, focusing on specific policies, time periods, political ideology, and, of course, typologies of institutional governments. With substantive typologies, such specific issue areas included foreign policy, energy policy, foreign policy, education policy, and many, many other different types of policy areas. The problem with this approach is there is an overlap of policy arenas. For example, farm policy has alternately been about family farms, the environment, economic security in both rural and urban areas, and even international relationships. Breaking public policy typologies into time period might include such things as post-World War II, Vietnam era, Reagan era, post-9/11. But the question becomes one of how does one cut the time period? Is the Vietnam era the Civil Rights era? Is the Reagan era the cocaine era? Is the 9/11 era the fear era? And what do we call our current era? Political ideology is traditionally accepted typological approach by identifying individuals and groups as conservative, liberal, and the extremes of communist and libertarian. But even with this in mind, what is the difference between George W. Bush's attempt to make all U.S. citizens obtain their retirement through the market and Barack Obama's healthcare market approach that forces all Americans to go to the marketplace through Obamacare? Although each relied on the market to bring about its results, one was a failed conservative approach and the other was portrayed as part of a socialist agenda. Finally, the institutional typological approach with legislative, executive, and judicial branches is the one policy theorists and practitioners are most familiar with. But there are still problems with the best approach to this and how to make the typologies work. For instance, how does one tell the difference when the executive branch plays the role of chief legislator in putting policy items on the agenda, even to the point of making policy decisions without congressional input? Likewise, when the judicial branch makes policy concerning who exactly a person is under the law, such as was the case with their defining corporations as individuals in their Citizens United decision, this may be seen as policymaking. Likewise, the definition of what property rights are or are not held by citizens, with the Supreme Court defining eminent domain rights, can be used for economic development in Kelo versus New London, Connecticut, and may be seen as moving well beyond their constitutional authority. In summary, from different perspectives, these actions may be seen as being part of institutions' action domain, or as well outside it, depending on who is making the argument. Arguably, the first and most important contribution to policy typologies in general was made by Theodore Lowy with his policy typology matrix that argued that policies determine politics, not the other way around. This was a starting point for all the prior research that politics determine policies. The most significant fact of government, according to Lowy, and the starting point for his typology, is that government coerces, with different ways of coercing, providing the set of parameters defining the context within which politics takes place. The first step in research, once this basic axiom was set, was that taxonomy should occur before ontogeny or phylogeny. In other words, you need to define what belongs where before you consider development of something, what is referred to as ontogeny, or relationships between policies across different domains, what may be considered phylogeny. The development of a good taxonomy is important as a first step because it leads to the creation of variables that are categorical in the sense of being inclusive by including all or as many cases as possible, and mutually exclusive with no one item falling into more than one category. This allows for hypothesis making and testing, which is the essence of science. The basic arguments behind Lowy's scheme are that political relationships are determined by expectations of those engaged in the political game. In turn, expectations are determined by government policies and their outputs. Thus, political relationships are determined by the policy at stake. The two dimensions in Lowy's policy typology that results from his theoretical development includes the likelihood of coercion and the application of coercion. With the likelihood of coercion, it ranges from immediate application to remote application, whether in the future or geographically. When coercion is applied, it can range from being focused on the individual directly or more generally to the environment. This leads to 4 categories of politics within the policy typology. Distributive policy occurs when there is a remote likelihood of coercion and it is applied to individual entities. This means that there is ease of disaggregation of results, as the loser and recipient need not to come into confrontation with each other. As a result, there is a perception of a non-zero sum gain, where no one gains at the expense of others. The constituent category has a remote likelihood of being applied to an entity, and this occurs with environmental application. It is with this category that Lowy moved from 3 major categories in his original 1964 World Politics Book Review and Analysis to filling out what the 2x2 would look like eventually. The regulative category has an immediate likelihood of being applied to individual entities. There is a direct choice of winners and losers to the level of individual entity, meaning there is a perception of a zero-sum game between policy recipients and government, with negative payoffs occurring. Finally, there is the redistributive category, whereas there is an immediate likelihood of policy application, albeit through the environment. The application of policy has a broader impact to the point of affecting social classes, and there might be the perception of this being a zero-sum game, albeit one in which players that are recipients come away with positive payoffs. Lowy applied this framework considering the institutional activities by U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt during his New Deal initiatives. Lowy carried out data analysis by considering all activity, which was measured in terms of amendments. Lowy found that FDR's policy-making ability was shaped by the environment. He was able to establish redistributive policies due to the fiscal environment of the time and through his rhetoric and public response to this rhetoric. However, Lowy notes that when redistributive policies were not available to him, FDR was willing to compromise on regulatory issues due to the lack of traction through public opinion and his rhetoric. Lowy also argues FDR was the first president to use all 4 systems of coercion. While this framework helps us understand public policy, especially during the Great Depression and FDR's executive response to it, it is inapplicable to up to 2/3 of the cases. However, when considering that there was no ability to classify and understand policy previously, 1/3 is more powerful than what was previously the case.